Okay, this is my first video in my series here on nutrient requirements of specific fish and specific groups of fish. And I'm going to start out today talking about the nutrient requirements of carps, which are in fact the group of fish which is farmed to the greatest production rate in the world today. And I will then talk about catfish, which ranks number 2 worldwide, and tilapia, uh, number 3 worldwide in following videos. So let's get started. So the nutrient requirements of carps is actually a fairly large topic because we have the Indian major carps, 3 species generally we talk about, and then we also have the Chinese carps, of which there are 4 or 5 species. And so when we're talking about nutrient requirements of these different species, then this simply adds more slides to the deck, and it all has to be covered. So if you find that this is a bit too long, certainly feel free to pause it and come back and watch it again. Or perhaps you might just choose to go into your YouTube settings and speed it up a little bit so that it doesn't take so long. But I'm anticipating it'll be about an hour here. So first, let's look at this picture. This is a picture of farmers harvesting Bighead carp, so a Chinese carp, in Bangladesh. So we then can begin. So carps are the most cultured species of all species that are farmed worldwide. And we can see by looking at this that carps are here at about 31 million tons in 2022. And that of all farmed species in the fish group, finfish group, it amounts to about half. And then next we see we have catfishes and we have cichlids, which is tilapias. And I'm focusing on warm water species, so I will cover these all in due course. So looking at carps, we have these Chinese carps, and they're called unfed carps. No feed is required. They only require fertilized ponds, and the 2 species that we're talking about here is bighead carp and also silver carp. Filter feeders, they don't need feed, they only need fertilized ponds, and so they can be fertilized with organic fertilizers, organic waste. They can be, in the past, they might have been fertilized with livestock manure. And then, of course, they could also be fertilized with mineral supplements and also organic or inorganic fertilizers if needed. And then for the fed carps, these are carps that in general are fed with feeds. And carps overall are the most sustainable farmed fish because in terms of feeds, they tend to be lower spec, lower uh, quality perhaps, lots of lower cost agricultural byproducts, and oftentimes local byproducts are being used in the feeds. So among the Chinese carps, we have the grass carp, and this is the #1 farmed fish worldwide. And then we have the mud carp, which is also known as dace, but this is not discussed too much, although it is included in Chinese carp polyculture. And then we have the Indian major carps. We have catla, which is often called catla. And then we have the rohu carp, and we have the Mrigel carp. And over here you see pictures of the three Indian species. And then we can't leave out Europe. So Europe also has a number of farmed species, and the common carp is the #3 species farmed worldwide. Now, this was one of the first farmed fish in Europe, and due to the expansion of European cultures around the world, this fish was spread and distributed worldwide. In many places, these fish, both the grass carp and also the common carp, are considered to be invasive species. But in Europe, common carp is a very popular fish, especially in countries like Hungary, where they make a very delicious soup from carp. Now, a subspecies, well, I don't know whether we'd call it a subspecies, but a fish that was developed from, genetically developed from common carp are koi carp. And so here, down here, we see koi carp. So these are the Japanese fancy carp. They now have their own species, but in the past, it's believed that they were developed from mutant colored common carp. We also then have the Crucian carp, we have the Prussian carp, and goldfish. The lowly goldfish, which we find in aquariums all over the world, is also one of the carps. Now, when we talk about carps are the most cultured species among all farmed fish, we can go and look at this paper over here, Trends of Aquaculture Production and Trade, Carp, Tilapia, and Shrimp. Here's the QR code. You can scan that and you can download this paper if you want to read it in more detail. So looking here then among the carp, we see that the grass carp is the largest production, silver carp, common carp, bighead carp, catla from India, Carassius, that's the species that we just mentioned. Here's the rohu carp and the black carp from China. And looking at the quantities, we see here that in 2019, it was approximately 20% of total production. Oh, sorry, that's 2018. And it amounted to about 5.7 million tons. Now, I don't know where I got this from. I couldn't remember, but it's from one of the books about carp in the world, in Europe, and it is not from a paper that was published. But it shows us the places that produce the most carp in Europe. And this is not dated according to year, but it's probably within the last 3 to 5 years. And we can see that Russian Federation is by far the largest producer, and then Poland, Czech Republic, Ukraine, Hungary, Belarus, Serbia. These are all the countries considered to be part of Eastern Europe that used to be in the sphere of influence of Russia. And then we also have Germany and France with some production here at the lower end. If we look at carp production in India, and we see here this is for 4 years, 1999, 2004, 2007, and 2010, this data is coming from this paper, Feed Management of Major Carps in India, with special references to practices adopted in Tamil Nadu. Uh, this you can scan the QR code and download it from there. So if we look, we can see that over time, Catla has by far surpassed all other carp species. And I don't really know enough about Indian carps to know whether it's a price issue or whether it may in fact be a issue related to the ease of carp farming. And a lot of the traditional Indian farmers feed carps by putting various agricultural products like rice and bran and so on into bags, which they suspend over the pond. And then the fish would come and browse and eat. Whereas more recently, carp farming has moved to manufactured feeds, and maybe this is part of the reason that this is happening. Now, we see here that we've seen a slight reduction in rohu. We've seen perhaps more than 50% reduction in regal carp, and then we have exotic carp. So exotic carps are, as noted down below, Chinese carps, major carp, um, and common carp, and so these silver carp is the one of the unfed carp species. Now, this is a graphic from this paper by Hicks and Ling on carps as an invasive species. It's a chapter in this book which is not available anywhere as a free download, but if you are part of an institution, a university, and you might have company access or university access, then I think you should be able to find it. And certainly in a library of a university, it might be there as a physical hardcover book. But as I mentioned earlier, one of the things was that if we look here, we see in the light gray color, this is the native range. So the native range covers Russia, Kazakhstan, Mongolia, China, and a little bit down into the cooler parts of Southeast Asia, and then over into Eastern Europe. But we also see then that it was introduced and established in many, many, many countries, all here in the darkest color gray. It's all over North America, all over South America, Australia, through the archipelago of Malaysia and Indonesia, and all across the South Asia and the through West Asia, even including into Egypt. So in these places it was introduced and it became an established species, and that's why we're talking about it as an invasive species. And then we do have a few places where it was introduced, but it was not established, and those seem to be all in Africa. So when we look at carp production here, not worldwide, but we look at carp production in metric tons in China, we have data for 2016, 2018, and 2020, and a comparison between 2020 and 2016 in the last column. And we see for grass carp, the numbers are somewhere around 5.5 million tons. And then we see silver carp is somewhere between about 3.1 and 4.5 billion tons, with some reduction occurring. About a 15% drop over this time period. And then here we have common carp and bighead carp, around 3 million tons for bighead carp, and then the black carp, which is around 700,000 tons. Okay, move on to the digestive physiology of carps, because this is an area of a lot of interest when we're talking about manufactured feeds and improving feeds by using supplemental enzymes and so on. So this is a digestive tract from a fed carp. In fact, it's the grass carp. And what we can see when we look here is that the carp's intestine is very long, and generally carps are stomachatless, and they have uh, a neutral pH, or essentially a neutral pH in the entire digestive tract. They do not have an acidic stomach. And when we look at this picture of the intestine, we can see that it's very long when it's unfolded, and that there are no serious bulges like a presence of a obvious stomach. This is a paper that you can go and find here from the QR code, and this author uh, has also posed a number of papers on different parts of the digestive system of grass carp. So when we look at carps from swim up fry to full-sized adult carp, we see a transition of the kinds of foods that they eat. At the youngest stages, they're basically planktivorous, so they're eating daphnia, they're eating copepods, and whatever else might be swimming in the water, plus uh, to some extent maybe microcellular algae. And then as they grow and they start to have access to other food sources, then they begin to add uh, things like mussels and insects, larvae, and maybe even in this case looks like any kind of water insects that might be, you know, moving on the surface of the water or in the water. And so then at large animals eating the vegetation and also uh, planktonic algae and so on is a very small part of their diet. And once again, this comes from this book, the same book that I mentioned earlier, but you have to find your own way to access it. This gives you the link to the publisher's website. Now, when we look at the diet of juvenile carp, we just mentioned the fact that they start out um, eating small microscopic organisms. We have chironomids, they're kind of a worm. We have daphnia, copepods, those are swimming arthropods in the water. We have worms, and then we have things like the caddisfly larvae, which are the ones that live in these little uh, tubes made from sand. And this gives us the nutritional profile of protein, fat, ash, and carbohydrate content. So this will then reflect the kinds of enzymes that these fish naturally show in their digestive systems. So here, first of all, we talk about optimum temperature of enzyme activity is around 38 to 39 degrees Celsius. So that's probably higher than we would find in most conditions in Europe. But it would be probably more suitable to the temperatures of the Chinese carps, at least in southern China, and also the Indian carps. So what I wanted to show here is that the carps, in fact, do have proteases, they have trypsin, and they have various peptidases that are involved in breaking down large protein chains into small peptides and even into free amino acids that would be easily absorbed. Note that carp do not have chymotrypsin. We then have esterases for digesting lipase, and we have amylase, which is involved in digesting starch. Now, this is data which is looking at bighead carp and also at silver carp, the two unfed carp species. And when we look by gut segment from the mouth to the rectum, we see, if you follow over here, you see the codes. So you see that we have silver carp are the dots and bighead carps are the triangles. And what we see that in these stomachless fish, that in fact, the bighead carp, the pH is above 4 at the beginning of the digestive system. In the middle, the pH drops to 6.8, very slightly acidic. And that may be, in fact, due to the fact that foods that animals eat tend to have some effect on the pH. Although generally when we talk about eating proteins and so on, they tend to have a slightly buffering effect and tend to be a little bit more alkaline. And when we look at the silver carp, we see that the pH starts at slightly acidic, but increases up to a neutral at about 7 as it reaches the end of the digestive tract. And when we look specifically at the enzymes, we see that their highest enzyme activity for trypsin and also for amylase are somewhere around gut segment 3. Now you can go back and look at that previous slide to get an idea about the different parts of the gut of the um, grass carp. Uh, but you can also find, searching easily, that you can find the pictures of the digestive system of, I believe, almost all of the species. This paper you can find here, and it is freely available. Moving on to Indian carps, this is some slides from this paper, Digestive Enzyme Activity in Different Size Groups and Segments of the Digestive Tract of Rohu, and you can find and download it from here. So we have different sized animals. I haven't put here what the sizes are, but this would be like, let's say, not larger than 20 grams. This might be 100 to 200 grams. This might be 200 to 500 grams. This might be to 1 kilo, and this might be above 1 kilo, something like that. And so when we look at amylase activity, which is affecting starch and glycogen, then we see that in the medium-sized carps, it is the highest amount. And probably the changes over time here are reflecting the differences in the natural diet of the carps as they grow and the diet changes. Here we see trypsin. Okay, and a moment ago I said that in the Chinese carps they had not reported chymotrypsin, but here it is showing chymotrypsin also present in the guts of rohu. And then, because these in fact are omnivorous or perhaps herbivorous at some part of their life, we see that they also have a fair selection of carbohydrates. So we see here we have the control, which has 100% starch. We see amylase has reduced the starch content by about 7%. And then we see cellulases and cellobiose and maltose are able to be digested quite significantly. And there is no lactose and no sucrose because those are not components of the natural diets of these fish. So moving now on to where the enzymes are located. This is data for grass carp. This paper is not freely available, but you can find it there at that scan. So we have cellulases found in the hepatopancreas. Well, it's not a stomach, but there is an area that has a large secretory surfaces for secreting enzymes. And then we have the intestine. So they fed a variety of different things. They fed a leaf protein concentrate. They fed lemna, which is a water weed that is commonly collected from the surface of ponds. And then they had artificial and natural feed, and then they had artificial feed plus tetracycline. Now, the reason for using tetracycline is that it kills off the native bacterial population, the microbiota in the gut. And so we can see here, if we look at 328 level of activity in the artificial feed and the natural feed, and then we see only 110. This suggests that close to 200 units of activity are actually coming from the native microbiota in the gut. That's why they use the tetracycline to kill it off. We look at the amylase, we see hepatopancreas, intestine, same, and they did not use antibiotics here. We see then the protease and the lipase and the difference between the hepatopancreas and the intestine. Now, this is a paper, feed-based common carp farming and eutrophication. Is there a reason for concern? So this is taking a uh, approach looking at whether using feeds for common carps is going to have a severe effect on water quality and causing eutrophication. And why would they be concerned about that? Because artificial feeds will contain considerable amounts of nitrogen and also phosphorus, and these can have an impact on eutrophication because they are the nitrogen is the uh, first limiting nutrient in water, and phosphorus is the second limiting. So here we see nitrogen on this slide, and the phosphorus is coming up on the next slide. So we have a list of ingredients here. We have animal fat, so that's affected by lipase only. We have animal protein, brewery waste. That would be basically distillers dried brewers solubles or brewers dried solubles. We have cereals, so that's generally going to be rice and corn. We have a commercial feed here, and then we have a variety of other things. We have oil seeds, legumes, and different parts of plants and so on. And we see that for different samples that were analyzed that there's quite a range, but this black bar is the mean of the range. And we see that with cereals, the apparent digestibility is kind of all over the place, but then we haven't defined specifically what the cereals are, at least this graph doesn't show it. But when we look at commercial feed, we see actually, in general, it has a pretty consistent and quite high digestibility, somewhere looks like around 80% digestible nitrogen. Let's move now to phosphorus. And we have the same ingredients, we have the same details, but when we look at commercial feed, we see that phosphorus is essentially not available to common carp. And we see likewise in oil seeds. Well, part of the reason for this is that ingredients like whole wheat, ingredients like soy, like canola, like rapeseed, like mustard seed, they have in their seed coats phytic acid. And soy has a lot of phytic acid actually embedded in the protein matrix. And so the phytic acid actually inhibits the digestion of phosphorus. It absorbs it, it binds to it, and it ends up being excreted. So phosphorus ends up being loaded into the waterway. And we can solve this problem by using phytase enzyme in feeds, but then the question remains, well, is phytase active at the alkaline pH levels when typically we would assume that it requires an acidic pH to be active? Okay, so let's move on now to studies on carp nutrient requirements. So this is going to be a lot of different tables, and some of them from the National Research Council's 2011 book on nutrient requirements of fish and shrimp. And those are noted here as NRC 2011. And let's have a look. So here we have carp protein requirements, and we have mirror carp, which is a kind of Cyprinus carpio, and then we have rohu and catla from several different researchers, and then we have the Chinese carps, the grass carp, the bighead carp, and then we have the jibbo carp, which is also grown in China, and the minor carp, which is another carp grown in Europe. And we see requirement here as percent of diet. Now, I have mentioned in another video that actually there is no such thing as a protein requirement for fish, but we set these protein requirements as guidelines to give us an idea based on typical feed intake, what would be the amount of protein required to more or less provide the fish with the amino acids it needs for growth. So one of the things that I note here is that some of these studies are quite old. There's a 1978 study here, and there then are more recent studies for the carps, most recently here 2016 and 2019. But I do have a bit of a problem with some of these results because today there is really no excuse to be just growing carp and basing a protein requirement only on weight gain. And even using FCR, there are so many other methods that we can measure as parameters, and I will show you some others that can be used in a later slide. Here we see protein requirements for grass carp and common carp, which were not included in the previous table. But we then show that the size of the grass carp is increasing, but still 10 grams is really small. So these are juveniles, not really, in my opinion, applicable to fish that are a kilogram or above. We see that there is some impact also on temperature, and we see that the percent if the dry feed. But what I like, as I've mentioned in other videos, that I like protein requirements to be expressed in grams of weight gain per day. And so when we look at it on this basis, we see that larger fish have lower levels of requirement because they're growing at a slower rate. Okay, so looking now at the lower table, common carp, body mass 1 gram up to 2 kilograms. And we see here once again, requirement is expressed in grams of protein required per kilogram of fish on a daily basis. And we can see fast growing fish require a lot, and, and larger fish require much, much less. Moving on to amino acid requirements. So here we see the regal carp from India and rohu from India, and then Cyprinus carpio from Europe. And this is spread, of course, all around the world. And we have the essential amino acid requirements from NRC. Now, one of the things NRC states is that under the conditions of laboratory experimentation, and I mentioned this in my earlier uh, videos about nutrient requirements, is that the conditions are perfect, the water is perfect, the fish are low stress, there's lots of oxygen, and in general, we would assume that when we're talking about commercial feeds with commercial ingredients, that these numbers are probably on the low side, that we have to account for lesser digestibility from feeds and ingredients. And nevertheless, we have to use these as guidelines. So here are amino acid requirements for catla, and these are done in this laboratory by Zera and Khan. This is at Aligarh Muslim University in India. It's a small university north of the Taj Mahal in this city called Aligarh. And Dr. Khan actually came to my university, the University of Washington, and studied with Dr. Halver, John Halver. And so he has continued to use the same basically research protocols that Dr. Halver used originally with salmon and trout. But now he's brought it up to date with much more modern means of assessing results. And so we see, for example, while we do have weight gain and protein efficiency ratio and feed efficiency, we also have total sulfur amino acids for this one. But when we're looking here, we see body saturation, and we also then see RNA DNA ratios. This gives us an idea about the rate of synthesis of proteins based on varying levels of these amino acids. And requirements here are stated as percent of crude protein. Here we have the amino acid requirements for Chinese carps, the GN carp, which is I guess a breed bred from the common carp. and then we have gibel carp, black carp, and then we have grass carp. So we don't necessarily have a full set in 2011 NRC for all of the essential amino acids. And we then see the parameters that were used, mostly weight gain and also specific growth rate. And this is percent of diet, and in brackets is percent of crude protein. Now, moving on to mineral requirements, we can assume that fish obtain some of their significant calcium requirements and magnesium requirements and sodium and maybe chloride, and to a lesser extent potassium and phosphorus from water. However, um, trace mineral consistency across fresh water can vary quite a lot. And so we see here the requirements that are published in terms of milligrams per kilogram body weight per day. So I like that. But what I don't like is that all of this is based on weight gain. And mineral requirements are actually very difficult to assess because, for example, phosphorus uh, is very dynamic. Phosphorus is taken from the food, very little comes from the water. You have phosphatases that break down the phosphorus and it is absorbed into the blood. But if phosphorus is not rapidly absorbed into the tissues and into bone, the phosphorus will actually be excreted again as a way to balance the phosphorus level in the blood. It will be excreted again into the intestinal cavity. And so consequently, when we start talking about minerals, we have this flux going in and this flux going out, and that makes it very difficult to assess. Now, notice also that all of these came from only one pair of researchers, only one paper, or maybe multiple papers by the same researchers in the same year. Looking now at different species, but we're looking now at so-called macrominerals. These are included in feeds in percentages, the percentages, rather than ppm or milligrams per kilogram. And we don't have much here. We have calcium, we have phosphorus for common carp, phosphorus for bighead carp, common carp from a different researcher, and then we have magnesium for a couple of species, and then we have calcium phosphorus ratio. Now, why is calcium phosphorus ratio important? The carriers from the gut into the blood inside the body are non-specific, and they respond to calcium as well as phosphorus, magnesium, and so on. But if you have too much calcium, calcium dominates those carriers, and then the animal can become potentially deficient in phosphorus and can also potentially become deficient in magnesium. But we typically will look at the calcium phosphorus ratio, and we normally want that to be somewhere between about 1 to 1 and 2 to 1. Although here it is suggesting with bighead carp, they've gone as high as 3 to 1. And in the common carp, apparently it stated that there was no relationship, but that's a very old result by Japanese researchers. Here we see a bit more detail about the phosphorus requirement of common carp. This is a paper where we're actually looking at adding phytase to the feed in order to try to make phosphorus digestibility and bone mineralization of common carp better than without using enzymes. And so when we look at total phosphorus in this case and digestible phosphorus in this case, we see here in bone phosphorus and in whole body phosphorus. Now, in fish, a significant part of the phosphorus and also the calcium is in fact stable in bone. But there is some movement in and out. If the body becomes deficient, if plasma levels of phosphorus go down, then the animal will pull both calcium and phosphorus out of the bone. So we see here that they fed multiple levels of phosphorus, and you can see at the lower axis here, 0, 5, 10, 15, 20, and 25. And they assess that the requirement is somewhere around here. So that's maybe 8, 8.5, something like that in terms of total phosphorus in the feed. And then we see that in whole body, it's somewhat higher. Likewise, if we look at digestible, so digestible is going to include the impact of the phytase enzyme. And we see when we add the phytase enzyme that actually the total amount is probably about the same, but digestible is maybe 70-80% better than very low as we saw before. And so we see here on a digestible basis that the values are lower. Moving on to grass carp, this is for magnesium. Here's the paper. It is not free, but you can find it. And if you have access, as I mentioned earlier, you can download it. I think this is actually quite an interesting paper. Here they have provided magnesium concentration up to 1400 milligrams per kilogram. And they've assessed that the weight gain, the best level, is around 700 ppm, which I find quite interesting because for channel catfish, it was determined that it was somewhere around 400. But for years and years, the books that we used told us that magnesium requirement of fish was very low, under 100 milligrams. So obviously that whole concept of magnesium requirements has been changed very substantially. And then when they look at vertebral magnesium concentration, so this is magnesium in the bone, we see that they've determined it's about 630 on bone only. Well, what's the difference? Well, if we're talking about 630 versus 720, then some proportion of the magnesium is actually metabolically active in uh, the physiological processes going on inside the grass carp. So here's potassium requirement. Now this is grass carp as well. And we then have the various levels of potassium that were included in the diet from 1.5 grams per kilo up to 10 point, nearly 10.4, 10.5 grams per kilo. So that's quite a range. And it's a very useful range because it gives us a very obvious inflection point on this curve. And it gives us a lot of data that we can use to calculate both the body potassium content, and then in this case they're looking at specific growth rate, which is percent weight gain per day. And they're setting the range is somewhere between 4.65 and 6. And very important, when we're talking about mineral requirement studies, they also measure the potassium content in the rearing water as being from 1.86 to 3.1 ppm. And that's a very important thing because mineral nutrition has always been kind of underplayed in fish because we generally assumed that they could get whatever they need from the water. And that may or may not be true, but it is held back studies of mineral requirements in fish for quite a few years. Now, moving on to microminerals, this is also called trace minerals. We see here we have copper, iron, zinc, and manganese for the common carp, all from these Japanese researchers from this 1980 paper. And then we have a couple of Chinese carps here for zinc, and we have a manganese value for rohu. And when we're looking at, once again, the lab of Dr. Khan in India, they're using weight gain and saturation and body saturation, and they're also looking at SOD because manganese is involved in this very important antioxidant enzyme, um, the dismutase enzymes. So here we have recommendations not in per body weight, but in milligrams of dry diet per day. Now, moving on to vitamins. So we have, first of all, the fat-soluble vitamins, and we have vitamin A, we have vitamin E, vitamin K, and these were numbers that were published in the NRC 2011. And then these values in this separated table are values that were obtained. Here we have a 2019 value and a 2012 value. These were published after the NRC. And then we have vitamin K here. Basically, it was also included in the NRC up here. Now, when we talk about vitamin A and we talk about vitamin D, we have to consider conversion factors. Very often, requirements have been stated in terms of IU, international units. But more recently, when we start talking about mineral vitamin premixes, we often see now that they're beginning to estimate in terms of milligrams or grams of premix. And so we have to have this conversion factor. And these are the conversion factors in milligrams of 1,000 units of vitamin A and 1,000 units of vitamin D. So water-soluble vitamin requirements, of course, there are many water-soluble vitamins. We have the B vitamins, B1, B2, niacin is B3. We have folic acid, pyridoxine B6, pantothenic acid, and vitamin B12, mostly all for the common carp. Now, here we have the requirements expressed in milligrams of kilogram diet, and then also in terms of requirement per kilogram body weight per day. And then we have myo-inositol and choline, which are typically required in much larger quantities than the other vitamins. So we have here upwards of 100 to say up to 400 milligrams per kilogram of diet. And we have choline is actually at 1.5 grams. And they have grass carp here, not grass carp, I guess, at 3 grams per kilogram dry diet. Now, we have requirements since NRC 2011 was published, and quite a lot of them, especially for the Indian carps, all performed by graduate students working with Dr. Khan in India. So we have folic acid, niacin, thiamine, and B12, and niacin for rohu, whereas up here it was for catla. And we see quite a lot of different parameters that are measured, including liver saturation, hematocrit, different blood characteristics, and so on. And then we have for catla, for thiamine, we have those other ones, but we also have uh, transketolase activity, which is involved in uh, metabolism of carbohydrates. And we have requirements here expressed in milligrams per kilogram of feed. Carrying on with some more vitamin requirements since NRC, we have biotin, pyridoxine, thiamine, vitamin B12 for basically the same species, and we have how it is measured, and once again this is requirements in terms of kilograms of premix. Now, we often single out vitamin C because it is the first vitamin that was really determined, and we also have a lot of things that we assign to vitamin C, not only in terms of collagen synthesis, not only in terms of detoxification of toxins and uh, pesticides, so on in the liver, but it's also very important as an antioxidant enzymes in tissues, as well as very important in the activity of white blood cells in immune function. So when we look here, we see that we have Indian carp, common carp, and the carp from China. And this is a uh, carp hybrid from China. They tell us the form of vitamin C that was used. Ascorbic acid is pure crystalline vitamin C. And the problem we have when we make manufactured feeds where we're using both steam as heating source and we have high water content and we have high temperature is that the vitamin C can be very rapidly degraded. Yet when we're talking about laboratory feeds, we could probably have these levels, and due to the fact that they're often extruded or pelleted cold, and we don't see much degradation. But notice these numbers are very high when we move then and consider that we have ascorbate 2 polyphosphate, and this is identified, often commercially as the one of the early versions of Stay-C, the stable vitamin C that was produced originally by Roche and then later by DSM. And we can see that the quantities come down considerably because this vitamin C in the stable form is not destroyed by commercial feed production, or at least it's minimally destroyed. Carrying on once again with vitamin C requirements, now for different species. Once again, now okay, we move on now to lipid nutrition of carps. I don't have a lot of information here, but there is a few things that are worth mentioning. First of all, in terms of fatty acid synthesis in almost all fish species, two key enzymes are missing. These desaturase enzymes that convert oleic acid into linoleic acid, and then another desaturase that takes linoleic acid and turns it into alpha linoleic acid. Basically, what's happening is we're increasing from one double bond to two double bonds to three double bonds. And because these two enzymes are absent, then we have to actually have a dietary source of linoleic acid, 18,2 carbon and 18 carbon 2N6, and 18 carbon 3N3. And when we feed linoleic and linolenic, then all fish have the ability to both elongate from 18 to 20 carbons and 22 carbons and 24 carbons. And they also have the ability to add more double bonds. So we can go from uh, N3 to N4 and N5, for example. And if we're talking about DHA, we can go to 22 carbons and 6 double bonds. So this is an experiment where they fed radioactive lipid to carp. And in this part of the study, they actually were feeding them a fat-free diet. This study is quite old, 2009. Back in those days, we were still able to use isotopes to do some of these studies, and lipid studies have benefited greatly from using radioactive isotopes. But more recently, laboratories have great difficulty in getting permits to do that because they have to be isolated and they're not allowed to allow any of the radioactive waste to escape. And people have to be trained, and laboratory facilities have to be totally closed. So it's quite difficult to do radioisotope studies today. But when we look at this, what we see here is 23N9. Well, let's just go back and look where 23N9 is. 23N9 is right here. And so if we do not have any elongation here to here, and from here to here, then we should see that oleic acid can be converted into 23,9. So let's go back and look at this. So we see in starved fish, or at least starved by feeding them a lipid-free diet, is that the amount of mead acid, the 23N9, no depletion at all. This basically tells us that it is not affected in any way by feeding a fat-free diet. It's not really very metabolically active. But if we look at 18.2, which is linoleic, and we look at 24, which is arachidonic acid, and we have 22.6, we see that at 38 weeks with German carp and 20 weeks with common carp, that there is depletion. So this tells us that these are metabolically active forms of lipids that the fish needs. And so these would be classified as deficiency states. So looking at freshwater fish essential fatty acid requirements, we see here in the middle of the table, grass carp, common carp, and I've included tilapia because it was right here anyway. And notice that they have a requirement for 18.2 linoleic and 18.3 linolenic, but in general, there is no assumption that they need EPA or DHA. So they have evolved in an environment where EPA and DHA are not found in much of the food supply, and they have genetically adapted themselves to meeting whatever they need through their own synthesis inside their bodies. As long as they have 18.2N6 and 18.3N3, they can produce what they need, which is a very different situation when we're talking about brackish water and marine species. So here we look at grass carp and common carp, and it's interesting. This is a paper in relation to sustainability, so they've given us the trophic level and the environment, and then note here that we have requirement for 18.2N6 and 18.3N3, but nothing for N3 HUFA, highly unsaturated fatty acids, and nothing for N6 HUFA. So if we look at essential fatty acid requirements by species, now where did I get this? I got this by asking DeepSeek. So this was the Chinese AI that was introduced in the middle of January 2025. And I asked it specifically to look for data from China because most of this information is published in Chinese journals, and I do not have the ability to read Chinese, and I don't have access to these at all because I couldn't search for them if I can't understand how to type Chinese. So I asked the AI instead, and of course, being a Chinese AI, it was able to translate Chinese papers for me and provide me with this data. So grass carp require 1 to 2% of dietary linoleic acid and 0.5 to 1% linolenic acid for optimal growth. And then papers have also talked about a requirement for a balanced ratio between N3 and N6, and they give us a range 1 to 1 or 1 N3 to as many as 4 N6. And then we have silver carp and bighead carp, higher demand for N3 fatty acids due to their planktivorous diet, meaning the planktivorous diet, the microalgae and so on, are actually producers of EPA and DHA. So genetically, historically, they have adapted to needing more in their diet. And so studies recommend that for larval stages, actually some EPA and DHA should be added into the larval feeds, but this could probably be left out of the feeds for larger fish simply because they're going to be able to eat very large quantities of planktivorous material, and they would probably be able to obtain enough with their diet. Common carp, they're able to adapt to plant-based diets, but still require some linolenic acid and alpha-linolenic acid, as you see here. But they also note that supplementing with some fish oil or algae improves fish meat quality. Then DeepSeek continued when we're talking about larval and juvenile stages of carps, that they have a higher EFA requirement, and instead of only 1% or 0.5%, they're actually recommending that we go up to 2 to 3% total EFA. So this is including both linolenic and linoleic. Now, when we talk about adults, we are more interested in the necessary use of essential fatty acids for improving immune function, because they're very much involved in membrane integrity and then also in reproductive health. And it's recommended that in broodstock that we should use N3 rich oils to enhance egg quality. Now that could be um, presumably a seed oil like canola or rapeseed, or which has upwards of 10% alpha-linolenic. It could involve other plant oils like flaxseed, or what we would call linseed oil, which is very high in alpha-linolenic, or certainly we could talk about some fish oil. When we talk about other things that might impact essential fatty acid requirements, we have water temperature, and cooler temperatures may increase requirements. And Chinese research emphasizes balancing EFA ratios to avoid oxidative stress while maximizing growth rates. Now, because we know that carps, especially the planktivorous carps, can obtain their essential fatty acids from the water, I asked it this question: do farmed carps beyond larval stages need a dietary supplement for EPA and DHA? And if not, which natural foods in the water body provide the minimal amount of EPA and DHA that carps require? And this is what it answered. Farmed carps beyond the larval stage do not typically require dietary supplements of EPA and DHA if their aquatic environment provides adequate natural food sources. So that's why the planktivores don't really need to worry about it, but maybe some of the other carps, which are more omnivorous, might benefit. Carps can partially synthesize these omega-3 fatty acids from shorter chain precursors, although conversion efficiency is limited, and that is correct. In extensive or semi-intensive farming systems, e.g. ponds with natural productivity, carps meet their requirements through consumption of natural foods. However, in intensive systems with limited natural productivity or high stocking densities, dietary supplementation may be necessary to ensure optimal growth and health. The following natural foods in water bodies typically supply the minimal EPA and DHA required by carps: phytoplankton. Certain algae, such as diatoms and green algae, produce EPA and DHA. Zooplankton, cladocerans, e.g. Daphnia, copepods, rotifers, accumulate EPA, DHA by consuming phytoplankton. And so if they're part of the diet of the carps, then it ends up in them as well. Insects at larvae. So we have aquatic insects like the chironomid larvae and benthic organisms that eat insects or eat algae may contain some amount of EPA and DHA as well. So detritus, unorganic matter, decomposing plant and animal material and sediments can provide trace amounts of these fatty acids, especially in systems with rich microbial activity. And when we talk about using microbes such as algae, such as Schizochytrium or some of the other Phlorostochytrid algae, marine algae in general, that can be used to produce DHA. There are some similar species in freshwater, which, if they're in the environment and they are consumed, could also provide. So that's what this is talking about. Now, here we have a paper looking at the fatty acid profile of Indian major carp, and it's freely available. We have mrigal carp and rohu carp at different sizes, less than 50 grams, 51 to 500 grams, 500 to 2 kilograms, and above 2 kilograms. And we see the fatty acid profile of the body expressed as total fatty acid content in total fat. And I've used arrows to highlight these two, linoleic and linolenic. Now notice that we do see some high long chain fatty acids. We do see some EPA and DHA here, and this could be involved from elongation, but also from some taking of aquatic organisms as food. And curiously, the largest animals seem to have the highest concentration in both instances of mrigal and rohu, and presumably then that may involve a change of diet because the rate of synthesis is not going to make it significantly different than these smaller sizes. And I just bring this up to remind you, as I showed you earlier, that uh, when we have this in the diet and this in the diet, this elongation process can occur. But due to the fact that there are many enzymes in the process and many steps, it's very energetically demanding. And so consequently, it is a slow and energy intensive process. So we can't really depend on it with rapidly growing fish, and we certainly can't depend on it for other species like marine or brackish water species. Okay, so here we are close to wrapping up, and I just wanted to mention a little bit about energy intake, energy budgets, and energy metabolism. When we're talking about energy, we're talking about the fact that a lot of the manufactured feeds rely on carbohydrates to provide a certain amount of digestible energy. However, in the natural environment, most fish obtain their energy from either protein or from lipids. And I shared this in another presentation that I gave, where when we look at these fish, and C represents the fact that they're all carnivorous species, we see that they have a lower digestible carbohydrate level recommended. And yellowtail is below 10, and these other species are below 20. And that's in general because these carnivorous species do not have the proper digestive enzymes. They don't have the amylase and others, but they do sometimes have some of these enzymes being produced by the gut microbiota. Where when we look at freshwater species, and we have here channel catfish, ictalurus, we have common carp and grass carp and milkfish, we see that they are able to tolerate considerably higher levels of digestible carbohydrate, and carp and milkfish are here at the top above 35 to as high as 40 and even 50% of the diet. And down here at the bottom, we have tilapia, approximately 40 is quite okay. Now, when we look at two species, and here we're comparing common carp and we're comparing Asian sea bass. Now, Asian sea bass is actually a species which is notable for having a very difficult time taking in dietary glucose, and insulin does not seem to work. The level of carbohydrates circulating in the blood as glucose or as some other sugars um, takes hours and hours to be reduced from the blood, where in fish like common carp and tilapia, the glucose can be absorbed quite rapidly. And I will be doing a separate paper on Asian sea bass nutrition, and so you'll be able to see the exact details there. But what we can see here, that as we have digestible carbohydrate intake as grams per kilogram of body weight per day, that in fact the fish can obtain considerable amounts of energy, and that when we look at Asian sea bass, on the other hand, very little energy can be obtained from the digestible carbohydrates. And in fact, most of the energy for Asian sea bass is coming from protein and lipids. So here we have a paper called Dietary Energy Budgets in Carp. This was published in Japan, 1996. You can find it on the uh, website. And I would advise you, if you go to this particular website, which is called J Stage, it's publishing papers almost all downloadable from Japanese researchers. Just search for more papers about carp and you will find all of the papers, and maybe many that I'm not talking about here, about different aspects of carp nutrition if you just do some global searches in the J Stage website. Okay, so if we look here at the relationship between digestible energy intake and percent gain, so that's weight gain in carp, fed these diets with different levels of energy intake, we can see to a certain extent, the more carbohydrate, the more energy you had in the feed, the fish continued to increase their gain. But we do see here in this experiment that a maximum seemed to be reached, where with this one there was no maximum reached, and presumably it might go on to even higher levels beyond 180 kilocalories per kilogram body weight per day. Now, when we look at not just simply percent weight gain, but we look at the effect on protein. So we have here digestible energy intake and PER, so that's protein efficiency ratio, and NPU is net protein utilization. I talked specifically about proteins and amino acids in another video in this group of videos. We can see here that according to digestible intake, we see protein efficiency, protein deposition increases at up to about 80 units of digestible energy, but beyond that, there is no improvement in protein deposition or protein utilization. And we see here that in these different experiments that they conducted in this particular experiment, they actually saw a reduction in net protein utilization at the higher levels. If you look at the code is down here, triangles are net protein utilization in white and protein efficiency ratio are in black. So here we are at the summary. So according to the FAO, the farming herbivorous fish like carps is the most sustainable form of aquaculture, and here's some of the reasons why. Carps naturally feed on lower trophic levels. Extensive carp farming requires no manufactured feed at all, so basically zero environmental footprint outside the farm itself. Semi-intensive carp farming benefits from supplemental feeding. So supplemental feeding is some protein, some energy supplies, maybe from coarse grains like wheat or bran or something like that, but no complete feeds. Only intensive carp farming requires complete feeds and full feeding. Carp feeds do not need high specifications or expensive ingredients, and that partly comes from the fact that we can include quite a high level of carbohydrate in feeds for carps, and carbohydrates tend to be much cheaper than fats and proteins. Juveniles may benefit from some dietary fish meal, but large fish are adaptable to high carbohydrate diets that are fish meal free. Carps provide a high quality, low cost protein to a significant percentage of the world's population. However, The only thing about carps is that they do not produce or accumulate much long-chain polyunsaturated fatty acids like EPA and DHA, and so we need to find those from other dietary sources, such as sometimes eating marine fish, squid, or other ways of obtaining our EPA and DHA. So that's the end of the presentation. One more slide to close up. This is again a picture of harvesting mixed carp species, including Indian major carps and Chinese carps from a farm in Mymensingh in Bangladesh. So thank you very much for watching. You can find me here on YouTube, but also I update my releases and so on uh, both LinkedIn and also on X, where I have an account, Fish Nutrition Expert. And then the audios from these videos and these presentations are also found on Apple Podcasts. So thank you very much for watching, and I will be recording another video soon. So I hope you found this presentation useful for you. I know it was a bit longer, probably longer than any other nutrient requirement video for species or groups that I will be recording. But if you stuck it out all the way to the end, that's really great. And please take the time to look at the QR codes to find the original papers and read them for yourselves, because I'm only able to just very briefly touch on a lot of very valuable information that you can get if you go and read those papers yourselves. Don't forget to like and share this video, especially if you're a student. Share it with your other students and your other colleagues, and subscribe to the channel. And if you find me on LinkedIn or you find me on X, you can be regularly updated when I release new videos there as well as other content. So thank you very much for watching, and see you next time.